Hi, everyone. This is Michael Rubino here with another Mold Talks. Today, we have Dr. Kasey Holland. You may recognize her from her podcast where she talked about her personal journey with mold. And today, we're excited to have her as an expert in the field, talking more along the lines of how prevalent this is and what she's doing about it. Kasey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So I want to dive right in, and I want to know, how prevalent is external toxins in what you're seeing, and how big of a piece is this in the puzzle of, increasing our health holistically?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you are well aware of OSHA statistics and how they estimate that I think it's that 1 in 4 homes has water damage that can actually cause health problems. But I think across the board with professionals that we can agree that it's much higher than that. And one thing that I see happen a lot is we have so many people dealing with Epstein-Barr virus and they just think that it's Epstein-Barr virus. But I really find that in so many of those patients, we're dealing with environmental toxins or mycotoxins from water damaged buildings. And so, I mean, I think it's extremely prevalent. I don't think that we have an exact number that's accurate, but I think it's very, very prevalent.
And I know Epstein-Barr virus and reactivated Epstein-Barr virus is your specialty. It's something that you actively help people deal with and treat and things like that. And how big of a role do you feel that mold, bacteria, and these external toxins that inhabit our homes play a role into that? As an example, are you seeing that it's taking people longer to recover when they're in those environments? Is it making them more susceptible to reactivated Epstein-Barr virus? Like, what are your thoughts based upon what you're seeing in the field?
I think it's very, very difficult to recover from Epstein-Barr virus if you're living in mold. And there's a couple of reasons. Mold creates oxidative stress in our body. So our body always is exposed to things and we create reactive oxygenation species. And that's how we combat things. It's how we respond to bacteria, how we respond to viruses or a stressful event. And our body has to clear it out and use our antioxidants. And when there's an imbalance and our body can't keep up, there's oxidative stress. Mold creates a lot of that. And EBV has a promoter protein that is signaled to reactivate when we have higher levels of oxidative stress. So you're automatically setting yourself up there. But then Dr. Jill Krista has talked about how mold also affects how your B cells are able to remember viruses that you've seen. And Epstein-Barr virus, that's primarily the immune cells that are affected. So if you're living in mold, your immune system, it's kind of like it doesn't remember that it's seen that before. So actually putting EBV into a latent state when you are in a mold environment is extremely difficult. And you definitely are going to be feeling worse. I generally don't see people feel better until they get away from the mold, especially when EBV is reactivated.
Yeah, no. So it's a very important piece of the puzzle. I personally, because I see people with all kinds of ailments, I personally think it's one of the biggest missing links in our healthcare system today is just looking at the external factors of what's getting into the body and how it's impacting it. Of course, I'm not a doctor, but this is just my observation and seeing so many different people with so many different ailments. When we let's tie that together real quick. So there's a lot of families that you see, right? And typically you're seeing 1 out of 4 or maybe 2 out of the 4. Is that accurate?
Of the family?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, we know that, let's say 1 out of the 4, when we're talking about mold here, let's say you're dealing with someone who's 1 out of the 4 people who are really significantly impacted. The other 3 out of 4 don't seem to be, or maybe aren't as cognizant or aware that there's some subtlety differences. Let me ask you this, because there's this big conception around, that it only affects some of us. For me, I'm a prime example of this because I'm otherwise known as healthy. I don't, have Epstein-Barr virus, Lyme disease, et cetera. Yet being in the industry for 10 years, I've noticed a huge detriment to my body from now versus then. And, certainly it's impacted me. And, it was so slight over the years that it wasn't until I like reflected from 10 years ago how that change really has impacted me. And so I wanted to ask you, from what you're seeing, do you notice if any of the other family members also, maybe they aren't directly impacted or having these experiences, but they notice a big change when they're out of mold and when they're also kind of focused on their health journey?
Sometimes, I mean, some people just really don't feel the symptoms, and some people are a lot more sensitive. So, 1 in 4 people have, a mutation with the HLA-DR genotype that causes them to have a more difficult time breaking down mold. So, those people are kind of your warning sign where they're really sick, they don't feel well. And those are typically my patients. And then they'll say, well, my husband's fine or whatnot. And what I do in those instances is treat the whole family, even if I'm not seeing the husband, well, they can still do some of our reduction processes for mycotoxins, make sure when we move, cleaning things out, because no matter if they are noticing symptoms at that time or not, they're still being exposed to mycotoxins, and they're still going to be disrupting immune response and more oxidative stress, or integrity of their mucous membranes in their nasal sinuses and in their gastrointestinal tract. We know that mycotoxins can change the microbiome in those areas. So they might not feel terrible, or they might not be as connected to their symptoms, or they might think it's just allergies or whatnot. Now, whether or not it impacts their life to where they're not functioning and they seek a doctor is difficult to say. But also, I think, thankfully, we're starting to see that health is an accumulation over our years, right? So it's kind of like somebody smoked cigarettes. Well, they might not have a cough the first 5 years, but then they develop lung cancer years later. So we still want to minimize that toxin load that we're putting in people's bodies, even if they aren't having immediate symptoms from mold like their spouse or daughter or son is, that may be more sensitive.
Yeah, let me ask it this way, just to get an understanding, if maybe the way I asked the question um, didn't produce the right thought in your head, right? If Have you ever heard of, maybe you're treating the wife or maybe you're treating the husband? Have you ever heard that, like, heard back from the family maybe a couple weeks later or a couple months later, hey, my husband, he wasn't really reacting to any symptoms, but all of a sudden, he's now got increased energy. He's, in a better mood more frequently. Has there been any subtle changes being noticed throughout the process from people who typically say they weren't impacted by it?
Yes, I would say cognition and energy are 2 big ones where, oh, I can think clearer, I can get more done throughout the day. And there are things that they notice that they might not have been aware were even impacting them.
The reason I ask that is because when I look at this scientifically, obviously we have the people that may have genetic predispositions, maybe they have other ailments that are going on. But when I look at this, yes, they may have more instantaneous reactions where their heightened sense of alertness is there. Where someone like me who didn't have an ailment, it took years of exposure for me to realize, hey, I'm not myself. Hey, I'm not feeling my best. This is not optimal. I'm still on my healing journey. I'm still not where I need to be. Right. So I wanted to get your feedback on that, because scientifically it makes sense. Like it should impact all of us. It's just that some may be more aware. They may be more symptomatic at the onset. And so I wanted to see if you saw that, you know, uh, and what percentage of people you think go through that, and if you agreed with that sentiment.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen it in my own husband. He was working in an old building in Georgia. And when I went in there, I would immediately was like, I have to walk out because I could tell there was mold because I'm very sensitive to it. And I was like, this is terrible. And as soon as, we actually worked with people to get that the staff out of that building because I was just like, this is too much mold for anybody. And afterwards, things that I noticed in him were he was sleeping better, he had more energy, but I also really noticed in how his skin looked. Um, Mold can kind of make you look like you have aged. I hear that all the time. And also the way he was able to maintain his weight and put on muscle, because I think it really affected his gastrointestinal health, and he wasn't putting on muscle when he was working out like he normally was. And so things like that, we also just don't associate with mold. We don't really think of those things or really minor changes. So it can be different for everybody, especially because we have different species of mold. So for some people, it's affecting their gastrointestinal tract more than it is their blood-brain barrier. But absolutely, those subtle changes I see a lot.
Yeah, no, it's important to highlight because people have this misconception that like, oh, it only impacts a few of us. It's so rare. It's not this big thing. But the reality of it is, I think this is an epidemic. I think this is a lot worse than we all would like to admit. And I think it impacts all of us. It obviously impacts us all differently. But let's look at COVID for a second, right? I may have gotten flu-like symptoms. My wife may have lost her sense of taste and smell. Other people were hospitalized. It didn't impact us all the same way. Mold is no different, right? Any microorganism is always going to impact people differently. But just because it impacts you differently doesn't mean it's not having some sort of negative effect. And I think
Absolutely.
it's really important to unpack that. How long have you been seeing people specifically for mold?
Let's see. It has been, it really started after my own experience, which we have talked about before. So I guess it's been about 3.5, 4 years now where I really focused on mold more.
And over those 3.5, 4 years, have you seen that it's becoming more prominent? Is it getting worse over time?
Yeah, and so part of it is I think about, I'm like, well, is it just because I'm seeing that more and more now, or is it, and there is more attention brought to it now, thank goodness, or is it because of chemicals that we're using that are making mycotoxins grow faster in buildings or things like that? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, because I definitely
Yeah.
think it's more prevalent.
Well, we talked about that statistic earlier. So the largest home survey ever done was in 1994 by John Spangler, and he identified that 50% of the homes he visited had visible signs of water damage. 80% of those 50% of homes had visible signs of mold. It's very interesting because first off, why is the largest home study ever done in 1994? Why haven't we renewed that study? It's 2022, very many years later here. Kind of goes to say that a lot of the theories behind all of this are very antiquated. They're not modernized. And we have newer technology to identify these things much better than we did in 1994. So I think a new study would be pretty good. I personally think it's worse. I also think that we've headed in the wrong direction with our homes and buildings, the way in which we build them. I mean, COVID, unfortunately, is going to cause a massive devastation. It just hasn't hit us yet because it's still ongoing. But the shortages of lumber, the way in which the lumber was left out in the soil, building the hundreds of thousands of homes, if not millions of homes that have been built over the past, however long that shortage has taken place, we're going to start seeing the effects of that because the problem is, and this happened to me too, but mold is in the home before the insulation and drywall even goes up, right? So I mean, these levels are got to be astronomical. People are going to move in. It's going to start to impact them over time, and I would say probably 4 to 5 years from now, we're going to start to see a lot more sick people because of the way in this which this happened. Um, we've also had just catastrophic water events, right? That have happened over the past few years. We know they're not being remediated right, because currently the remediation and the standards in which people remediate homes just is not enough from a scientific perspective. How do I know that? Because I've been to so many places that have been supposedly remediated that it looked like the problem was gone. Scientifically, the problem is not gone. We're still able to define the fact that it was still in existence. So when I look at all these factors and I just kind of fast forward it over time, I know it's going to get worse. It's unfortunate. It doesn't have to, there's a lot of change that's needed. But I think that unfortunately, just like any other change, we went through 50 years of smoking cigarettes before we said, cigarettes maybe not the best choice for our health. So we're going through this curve, right, of realizing that this is a problem. We're ahead of the curve now. I think, you said it earlier, we're more aware today than we were probably 10 years ago. And of course, that's caused more people to call and more people to reach out and take action. But that's just a small sliver, right, of what's actually in society. I had a nice talk with Dr. Neil Nathan the other day. He estimates 10 million people suffer from exposure and have health effects due to it. And that's just in the United States. I think, I asked him if that number was conservative, and he said, oh God, yes. Right. So that's a conservative number. It's probably much higher. It's hard to nail this down because we're not actively studying it really. So I think it's definitely a problem. I appreciate all you do because obviously, when you have such a big problem and you don't really have many people to turn to, it's really important, and I think that I don't think enough can be said about that. We're all essentially the tip of the spear right now. And I know there's people that came before us and they were the tip of the spear too. And of course, they've helped pave the way for us. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of pavement left that needs to be done. I mean, we're just scratching the surface. So
I want to highlight something that you said in regards to COVID and in regards to the mold being there before we even put up the products and the drywall and all that. Because a lot of times I have patients that say, well, I just moved from mold and I moved into a new house. And one thing that I've been seeing happen with COVID is, my father is a builder. So I know all about the inflation that's happening. But the other thing that's happening is we have a huge demand for housing because we have a lot of people moving. Right. And certain areas are building homes very quickly that may not have the best thought out process for preventing future water damage, or they are using materials that may be lower quality to compensate for the outrageous inflation that we've seen in the building process. Totally. So now we have people that think they're moving into, well, this is a new home, it should be okay. And we are still seeing them not feeling well moving into that and finding problems with, well, there was mold or it was built with products that had mold or whatnot. So I think that's really important to highlight. And I'm sure that you can speak more to the reality that you can have mold in a new home. But I know that's been something that I really want to get the word out, because I try to talk to patients before they move so that we can talk about those things, because it's so devastating when we have somebody that moves out of mold into what they think is a safe environment and it still isn't safe.
Well, this is where logic gets confusing, because logically it sounds right. If I move into a new home, how can it have mold? Because people connect mold with, just the age of the home. Oh, if it's older, it probably had more leaks, more opportunity for water. And you're not necessarily wrong there, right? But sometimes older homes are built better because they were built slower by artisans, as opposed to kind of what's happening now, as you mentioned, where we're just slapping up homes. The construction industry is not required to understand mold or bacteria, which are like the two biggest things that really impact our homes in a negative way. And I think that needs to change, right? If imagine if every builder was required to understand how mold and bacteria come into existence, especially inside their home, and how to protect against that. They're not. I mean, I've sat across from builders telling me things, and they'll say, I'm not a mold expert at all, but I know the mold is dead. Well, are you a mold expert or not? Because you're telling me the mold is dead, but it's actually not dead, right? So it's really interesting kind of how it all works. But we're as consumers, as a society, we look at a builder and we think he knows what he's doing, or she knows what she's doing, and we just take the word at face value, like, oh, he said it's dead. It's just lumberyard mold. It's just surface mold. I mean, however many names you want to call mold, it's still mold. And mold is specific species, part of specific kingdoms, and they are toxigenic, pathogenic, or allergenic. And there's no such thing as mildew either, although there is, but it's still part of the Ascomycota kingdom, which is still mold. And the word mildew is derived from powdery mildew, which is a fungus that grows on plants. And we think that that's just harmless when it actually is a mycotoxin producing mold. So it's very confusing. And it's society kind of gets wrapped up in this, and we believe people and we trust people, and we should. But if we're going to trust people, we should also verify that they understand and the science behind what it is that they're doing, and that they can protect us, right? Because that's part of trust. We trust people to protect us. And right now we have people that prioritize profits over protection. And that's kind of where we go down this rabbit hole. And this is the American dream, right? And I get that. But the reality of it is that if we don't start confronting this problem and start facing this, there is no more American dream, because we're going to be too sick to dream. And I think that's kind of the way we're headed. And that's where I'm starting to say, look, we have to do something. And it's going to take an army of people, because how do we create change? We demand change. How do we demand change? With our dollars, right? If I only start going to doctors like you that can help me, all the other doctors, and I refuse to go to any other doctor that doesn't acknowledge or accept this, guess what? Those other doctors are going to have to get with it, or they're going to get left behind. Same thing for construction, same thing for real estate, and it's about demanding that they have this, that they get educated, because at the end of the day, we don't want to buy products that make us sick.
Absolutely. And I think in our culture, and I know I see this happen all the time because a lot of people, the first thing they're coming to me for is their fatigue, because it gets to the point where they can't work anymore, is they say, well, I think it's just from this little bit of stress and I hear people say all the time, well, it's just a little bit of mold. Like it's just, we use this word just to normalize things and normalize it. And we have to, whenever I hear somebody say just, it's instantly like a red flag for me of, okay, we need to educate about what this just is.
It's short for justify.
Yeah. But it's interesting because we do know these things. We do know that mold is bad kind of intuitively, but then we kind of don't want to go there. So it's just a little bit of mold and we keep moving on.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, right? It's like, if mold wasn't so bad, why is there people like me that get paid to remove it? And I'm not the first one ever, there's been 50,000 companies that came before me. So it was always a business. It was always people doing it. And if mold wasn't so bad, why did people remove it then? And why does the EPA tell you to remove it? And why does FEMA tell you to remove it? Because it's not great. Now, people don't like to admit how it can impact our health because it creates panic. But I disagree. I think it doesn't create panic. It empowers us to take action when we need to take action. It empowers us to take control of our environment so we can take control of our health. That's what I think it does. And I think the whole panic and all that kind of stuff. I mean, is there people peddling panic? Sure. I'm sure that happens, right? But the reality of the situation is, if you know better, you can do better.
Exactly. Yep. And I think that the more that we can talk about it and educate, and hopefully also educate, insurance companies and things like that, that way, when there is mold, people don't feel so alone financially or health-wise, and they don't feel like somebody's going to look at them like they're crazy. And that's what you're doing with educating people and sharing this and getting people on board is so important.
No, it's true. Like what we're doing is very important, and there needs to be probably 100 times more than us, to really help and get the change that we needed. Insurance companies, a great point. Many people, they either don't have mold coverage and have no idea, because they just say, oh, I'll just shop around for the best rate. And, it's like they look at it like car insurance, like just give me the best rate, least monthly payment possible. But at that comes less coverage, right? The cheaper it is, the less coverage you are. So typically when people need it, they realize you're not covered for that. You don't, or you're only covered up to $10,000, which is like some of the states, how that works. And so when you need it, you don't have it. And I ask myself, what's the point of insurance then? And considering that water damage is probably one of the biggest impacts, that you would want to be insured against and not really having insurance for it that can create mold and bacteria in this type of situation leaves us seriously injured because it happens almost all the time. I would say like 99% of my clients do not get adequate coverage for what they need to fix. And, these are cases that are considered covered losses, but they'll only cover the water damage and the reconstruction. They won't cover the mold aspect or the bacteria aspect, right? And it's like, at that point, sure, it looks like it never happened, but scientifically, there's all these particles. There's still these sources that are creating these particles. These particles are getting inside of our bodies, and we're never the same. And how is that fair? It's not. And so, yes, that education needs to reach into the political government to protect us against these types of things, because at the end of the day, unless there's a noble insurance company out there that's going to say, I care more about the people that I protect over the profits, we're going to keep having that situation. And, it's like when you look at the history of the insurance companies, most of them, they've changed things to prioritize profits, right? They've changed the way they caps. There used to never be a mold cap back in the day. It used to be covered up to policy limit. Well, what happened? Well, they started realizing it's very expensive. We're going to cap it. That's not fair, because how many people need it and don't realize? A lot.
Absolutely.
But we're fighting the good fight here, and all together, all in our different sectors. Obviously, medically, this is really important. As so many people go doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor looking for answers, and it's in your head. Maybe you should see a psychiatrist, things like that, until they finally find someone like you who's like, hey, have you thought about your environment as a potential culprit? And that's where their journey really starts. It just takes a little nudge. And then people intuitively start to think, well, I did move into this new place. Well, I did have some water damage, that could have resulted in this. So let's dive into that real quick to give people some background on things they can do if they're starting this journey. What types of testing do you like to use to identify if external exposures is something that they're experiencing?
Yeah. So once you have experienced mold and seen a lot of people with mold, you can kind of spot it. It's almost like there's a flavor or a scent to it. When you see somebody, you just like, oh, it looks like they're dealing with mold. But there are symptoms that can be alerts. So, we have the common well-known symptoms to more mold allergy, where, you're sneezing, you have sinus congestion, things like that. Sinus congestion is very associated with mold, but a lot of times people don't have sinus congestion, and so they think, oh, well, it can't be mold because I don't have any of those symptoms, and that's not true either. The truth is that mold can affect every system of the body. And so one thing is, if you notice a lot of different symptoms, if you feel anxious and you have headaches and you have brain fog, you're also not sleeping, you're also needing to urinate all the time, you also are having digestive changes. When you have all those different things kind of coming on, that's a really, really big indicator that we need to check your environment, check for mold. So when I test, sometimes people aren't quite open to the idea that it's really mold. So I try to do things to kind of help bridge that gap. So if they're not ready to do an actual test and invest in that, then things that I'll do is I'll have them take Dr. Jill Krista's mold quiz. It's just a symptom score sheet, and that gives them like, oh, these symptoms can be from mold. I'll also have them do Dr. Shoemaker's VCS vision screening test, and that's looking at their visual acuity. If they fail that and they're scoring high on that Dr. Jill Krista quiz, then it's like, okay, we really should check for mold. And then we typically do a urine test. I like Vibrant Wellness urine test, and we can see the mycotoxins and species. And at that point, I usually also, we're talking about their home or their work environment, and I suggest an ERMI test and finding a mold literate inspector that can start looking. So it depends on if the mold is obvious or if it's not, and how comfortable they are. Sometimes we need to do some steps so that they really feel like they're ready to invest in doing those. But those are the things that I start with. And then from there, depending on their symptoms, we might be tracking their symptoms and seeing how they're doing using shoemaker labs that really help us see what's going on in the body and how it's affecting the immune system and the vasculature there. That kind of varies based on their symptoms, but that initial phase, the mycotoxins urine test is very helpful.
Now, I created a new product that hasn't come out yet, but I want to tell you about it right here, right now, because I think you're going to love it. So this is going to be really helpful for doctors, especially, and this is kind of why I created, because like there's so much missing at the beginning of the journey. And let me tell you why I created it first, and then I'll tell you about it. So many times people, they either get like an ERMI or what have you, or they just go right into the inspection phase, right? And they hire this inspector and the inspector comes out. And of course, not inspectors are created equal. And they go in and they get this inspection. Sometimes the inspector themselves, they'll do like their ERMI, mycotoxin, endotoxin, actino, et cetera. And then they'll do all these air and swab samples, right? But what I'm finding where some of the biggest failures or problems are is, let's say the ERMI said, there was chitomium present, but they're not finding it, on the source sampling, right? Now we know and then by that time they've already moved on to another client. This is your report. You're like, well, where's the chitomium? Or maybe the remediator doesn't pay attention and ask, hey, where's the chitomium coming from? And just starts remediating, right? This is how so many things get left in the dust, literally. And sources remain in people's homes and they still don't feel well after remediation. So I said, how do we solve this problem? What if we did all that dust testing first and then actually turned that over with a plan to give to the inspector to say, find me where these sources are, right? And your job is not complete until that's done. And how do we do that? Well, we can understand and look at markers depending on whether it's ERMI, endotoxins, mycotoxins, and the actinomycetes test. We actually can look at all of them and come up with a comprehensive plan and to give to the client, to give to the inspector and say, find me this. And if they don't find something, they may need to come back and do some more sampling. And sure, the client can move forward on some of the other areas just in terms of effective timeness. But in terms of making sure that the house really is a safe home after, I feel like you almost need to work it a little bit backwards than what we're currently working at it. And I have a very big hunch that after this process rolls out, we'll start to see even more success out in the field. And the test is called the dust test. And it's going to combine, there's going to be 3 different packages, but it's going to combine different tests in one dust sample that you can get analyzed by the lab, cheaper than what you would get it from the lab by themselves, because it's going to be all packaged together and it's going to be purchased in bulk and pass that discount on to the client. And it's going to come with a consultation. So you know what's in your dust. You have to figure out how and then you'll have the roadmap of how to find out where it's coming from. Then when you actually remediate, you're going to get it all.
That is awesome for so many different reasons. First off, just for the doctor-patient relationship, because, when you work with a doctor, you need to trust them or else your guys' plan is just not going to really work. And so when I say, yeah, I think there's mold and I see the ERMI test, but the inspector either has no idea the importance of an ERMI or just went and looked and says there's nothing. And then the patient comes back to me and says, well, I had a mold infection and there's nothing. And it creates this environment where, well, we don't have a way forward, even though we know you're sick from your environment because we can see it, that it's affecting these markers in your blood and your urine. So that's so important, but also it's going to save so much time and money for people. For one thing that I think is really nice too. We've been in the military in the past, and so we move a lot, and it's so hard picking out a home and moving all the time. So it's like, well, if you can have those tests on hand and just, when you do your showing or whatever, be like, hey, can I just take a sample before I move in here? Especially for people that are mold sensitive. I think that homeowners would like to know that too, because if you move in there and you're sick and then you're trying to break the lease and everything, it's a disaster for everyone. So I'm really excited. I would love to have it because we have to move again. And so I'm like, how am I
Yeah.
going to test the next place?
So it's literally called the dust test. And
That's
you'll be able to go to thedusttest.com. And my vision for this is for it to be in every doctor's office in America. So you have an inkling that mold could be prevalent, bacteria, or anything that really results from a water damaged building. They're walking out with that box,
right.
that sample, going home and testing. The results can be emailed to the doctor, the patient, and the company, the dust test, where the company then sets up a consult. Doctor can join the consult. Basically, the
Mhm.
consult's going to go over, here's what we found. Here's why we think you have sources of these particular species, this particular bacteria, this particular toxin.
Mhm.
And these are the four things that we need to see from the inspector. I also have another product coming out called My Mold Report,
Mhm.
mymoldreport.com. That's where people will literally just go and send their mold reports to, and it'll analyze the mold reports to see what data is actionable, what data is missing. And this way people can decide if they want to get supplemental data or not, or if they just want to move forward with what they know. At least they know that this is what they can expect, because that's been another problem. So many people come to the table and say, I want a perfect ERMI score. And it's like, well, they only have one air sample in their kitchen. Like, we have no idea where the sources are
Right.
coming from. And so it's just to help people, no matter where they are in their journey, to get the answers they need. And they can go and hire anyone they want. They don't have to hire me, but at least they'll have the resources to make the right decision.
Yeah, and it'll help hold inspectors accountable. So everybody will be on
Mhm.
the same page. There's none of this, well, I didn't see anything, because it's like, but there's obviously something there. So
Totally.
you'll be holding people accountable, which will hopefully just cause people to do more education around mold and take it more seriously. So that's going to be a huge impact. It will definitely be in my office available. So that's really
Perfect.
exciting.
No, I'm really excited because, I'm always trying to figure out ways to help people. I know you are too, I'm sure. And so those are the two things that I was like, you know what, if these two things existed, I guarantee you it would help so many people. Because like one of the most disheartening phone calls that I get, and I get them a lot more than I'd like to get, is, hey, I did all this work and I'm still sick and I can't figure out why. And I'm usually like, send me everything. And I'm looking at and I'm like, oh my God, well, there's definitely sources there that weren't identified. There's they definitely didn't clean up properly. You still have settlement in there. They're not looking at the dust, and what's in the dust gets inside of our bodies. It's just how it works. And that's why
Mhm.
this whole misconception around air testing is a tool, but air testing captures, 5 minutes in one small little area across the entire house. And mold
Mhm.
doesn't emanate very far. Bacteria doesn't emanate very far. Of course, what happens is it emanates, it settles in the dust. And then as you move through the room, as the HVAC turns on, doors and windows open and close, et cetera, that dust gets kicked up and then it gets into your body. So it's like the way in which we utilize the technology that's available is really led down this path where people aren't getting better. And that's what drives me nuts, because this is supposed to work, right? Because we have science, we can scientifically improve the environment, but we have
Mhm.
to utilize the science and stop listening to people saying it's no big deal. Well, the air test is inside is better than outside, so your place is healed. No, that's not true. That's one aspect. So I hope to be able to bring these products to the marketplace and hopefully help more people. And I'm excited that we'll be able to send you some and have them in your office as well.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's kind of like if you're going in for a surgery on your shoulder, you're going to have an MRI before you go, or else your
Right.
doctor's going in there blind
Right.
and hoping to get it all. You don't want to be done with surgery and then be like, well, you're still in pain, so we must have missed this over here and I have to go back in. You do an MRI so you have a bigger picture of the whole area, and it's kind of setting it up for success like that, which will hopefully also be a big financial saver, because we know that when we do have to remediate, it is expensive to do those things.
And thank you so much for your time here today to talk about how serious and important this is, and talking about the work that you're doing to help people. And so just before we go, any last parting advice for somebody who's could be on this journey, whether at the beginning, the middle, or the end? What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I would say to really have high standards with mold. And the reason I say this is because when you go in and you fix it right away and you take care of it right away, you're going to save time and money, but you're also going to save your health. And what I see happen is there's so many different things that we could talk about, like fogging and different things that don't actually fix the problem. And so really take your time, do your research, get a consult, really listen to yourself, and don't underestimate mold. And then be ready to change things and to do things, because it really is worth your health. Like we talked about with Michael, you might not be feeling awful, you might still be functioning, you might not notice it a lot, but it can still have long-standing effects on your health. And so to really take it seriously, I think that's the biggest thing, is to just really be aware of it and really put the time in to address it and not just shrug it off.
Good things take time. You want to prepare, plan, execute, and good things take time. So unfortunately, there's no magic pill or solution to this. There's no magic wand to make it go away. There's no pill that you could swallow that'll flip a light switch and make you 100% better instantaneously. It's a journey. You got to prepare, plan, and then execute. So, Dr. Kasey Holland, thank you so much for being here today. This was such an amazing conversation. Hopefully people see both the passion in us, and learned a little bit here today, and hope to do this again with you soon.
Yes, thanks for having me. And thank you for all that you're doing, Michael.
Likewise. Thank you. Talk to you soon.